Okay, so we have just finished our bell ringer, so we should have our guided notes pulled up so we can fill them in as we go. What are we talking about today? Today I can demonstrate that plate boundaries are responsible for most of Earth's landforms. So we talked about tectonic plates, but we haven't talked a lot about plate boundaries. So what is that? What are plate boundaries? So a plate boundary is where two different tectonic plates are going to meet. So we remember those tectonic plates, those are those pieces of that lithosphere that are present on the surface of the Earth, and they fit together like puzzle pieces. So if you look where that arrow points, you see the line, those are the edges of the tectonic plates. So where they come together, where they fit together like those puzzle pieces, that is that plate boundary. So there are different things that are happening at these plate boundaries because, like we talked about before, those tectonic plates are constantly moving slowly, but they're constantly moving with each other. So depending on the direction they're moving together, they're going to cause different landforms to form. So before we dive into the three types of plate boundaries we're going to talk about, one thing I want to get straight, there are two types of tectonic plates that we can have. We got to define them first. First, you can have those continental plate boundaries. So if you see a continental plate boundary, all that means is that plate is on dry land. It's on a continent. Pretty easy. And the opposite of that is an oceanic plate boundary. So those are, just like it sounds, in the ocean. Pretty easy. So continental, dry land, oceanic, the plate is in the ocean. Okay, so let's talk about these three different types of plate boundaries and what they're going to make. So first, if you have two plates, when they are moving, if they are coming together, that's going to be your convergent boundary. So when you see, we're going to use arrows to demonstrate the way the plates are moving. So when you see two arrows pointing toward each other, that means that the plates are colliding, so they're converging. So that is a convergent plate if they're moving together. Now the opposite of that is going to be a divergent plate. Divergent. So if you see the arrows going apart from each other, think D for divide. They're dividing, so they are moving away from each other. So convergent, colliding, divergent, dividing. Think of what these words start with. So C, think collide, D, think divide. Okay, the last kind, the word we use doesn't really start with what this word starts with. If you can think of something, let me know. But the last type is going to be that transform boundary. So when you see two arrows sliding past each other, think transform because they're sliding past. So they're not coming together, they're not dividing, they're literally sliding past each other. So that is that transform boundary. Okay. So you always want to look at those arrows because they're totally going to tell you what type of boundary is happening. So what's forming at the three types of boundaries? Let's look at the convergent boundaries first. So where those two plates are colliding, they're coming together. If you have two continental plates, so a plate that's on dry land and a plate that's on dry land, and they form or push together, that is going to form a mountain. Kind of crazy. And it makes sense if you think about it. You've got these two rocks coming together. When they collide, it pushes up. So those rocks push up and up and up until you get these mountains formed. Pretty neat. This is where it gets a little crazy. If you have a continental plate and an oceanic plate and they collide, what's going to happen is something called subduction. Okay, what is subduction? That means that the denser, when they collide, the denser or the heavier plate is going to sink underneath the other one. So if you look here in this picture, we've got these two plates coming together, and we know they're coming together because remember we have those arrows, they're pointing at each other. When those two plates collide, the heavier one, in this case that oceanic crust, is going to go under. Now, what's forming here is actually going to be your volcano, because when that oceanic crust goes underneath, that gives room for that magma to come up through where that mountain will form, and it's going to make a volcano. So continental, oceanic, colliding forms a volcano. Same thing over here. If you have two oceanic plates, the heavier one is going to go under the plate that it's colliding with, and you're just going to get an underwater volcano forming. So continental, continental, you've got the mountain. Continental, oceanic, that subduction happens and you got the volcano. And oceanic, oceanic, you also have a volcano. Okay, this one, ooh, I know we're probably getting sick of hearing about this, but that divergent boundary, what's going to happen there is that seafloor spreading. Because we didn't call this a divergent boundary before, but now we know the plates are separating or dividing. So that's that divergent boundary. So that's where that seafloor spreading is going to happen. Those plates are going to move away. That hot magma is going to rise up and cool to form rock, which is going to form that mid-ocean ridge. So anytime you have a divergent boundary, those are almost always going to be under the ocean, and they're going to go through that seafloor spreading. Okay, last but definitely not least, we have our transform boundary. That's when those two plates are sliding past each other. So what's going to happen at transform boundaries is those two plates sliding is going to create what's called a fault or a fault line. And where those fault lines are happening is where you're going to get those earthquakes. When they move suddenly, that's when an earthquake happens. It happens at that fault line. There's a lot of earthquakes that happen over here in California because right there they are sitting right on top of a transform boundary. So they are constantly getting those earthquakes. Okay, convergent collide, divergent divide, transform, slide. That's all you got to remember. And then think about what's actually happening to help you remember which landforms are going to form. Okay, that's it. Hit me up if you have any questions.